strong family resemblance. Aloud, she snapped, "Family album, indeed! What I'm after is to get permission for this child to have a pet. I'm positive it would make all the difference in the world to him." "You won't get permission, nurse. Mrs. Frank won't have any other pets around to bother precious Kiki," he said grimly. "Not if it's a matter of life or death?" she persisted. "She would laugh at your putting it just that way," growled the doctor, an absent expression stealing over his kindly face. "Well, we'll see what we'll see," observed Miss Beaver cryptically, her mouth an ominous tight red line. The doctor suddenly spoke close to her ear, an odd note in his voice. "I'm going to prescribe something very unusual, nurse. Tomorrow night a covered basket will be delivered here for you. Take it into the boy's room and open it if he wakens during the night. Understand?" "I can't say I do, Dr. Parris." "You will," he promised. "I'll take that basket and its contents when I come around for my morning call. Unless," he told her grimly, "I can see no way to make the prescription stick." It was with the utmost anxiety that Miss Beaver awaited the coming that night of old Mr. Wiley. The day nurse had told her that Frank had eaten a good lunch and what for him was a hearty supper. He had agreed to sleep if he were awakened the moment Spot arrived, and Miss Beaver had accepted his whispered offer. To her relief he fell asleep immediately, natural color on his thin cheeks. Mr. Wiley's light tap came on the door panel. She met his grave smile with a soft exclamation of welcome. The small dog was tucked under one arm, and he paused to warn her with that admonitory touch of one finger to his lips that the secret of his visits must be preserved. She nodded comprehension, leaned over the sleeping boy, and whispered softly in his ear. He stirred, opened drowsy eyes, then he pulled himself up on his pillow, reaching thin hands out to the spotted dog, which nipped playfully at him. "Isn't he wonderful? When may I have him all the time?" "When you're well and don't need a night nurse," promised Miss Beaver rashly, and was rewarded by a broad smile from the courtly old gentleman, who tipped back his white maned head and laughed silently but wholeheartedly. "I'll get well at once, nurse. Don't you think I might be well enough tomorrow? Or the day after? Not," he added politely, making Miss Beaver's heart ache with his childish apology, "not that I want you to leave, you know." "That will be for the doctor to decide, Frank. But the more you eat and sleep and grow happy in your heart, the faster you'll get well," advised Miss Beaver earnestly. For a long, happy hour young Frank fraternized with the fox terrier, while the old gentleman sat silently observing him, a grimly humorous smile hovering about his firm lips. Then the boy's eyes began to cloud sleepily, and, much to Miss Beaver's surprise and pleasure, Frank relinquished his canine playmate and fell asleep, a blissful smile curving his childish mouth as he breathed with soft regularity. Then old Mr. Wiley picked up the puppy, tucked it under one blue-clad arm, and again admonishing Miss Beaver with a finger athwart his lips, tiptoed from the room, closing the door behind very gently. The nurse thought with a sigh of relief that the old gentleman had looked both pleased and gratified. She herself could hardly wait for morning and for the day to pass, and was both pleased and encouraged herself when she went on duty the next night. Frank had asked to sit up for supper, and when Miss Beaver entered the room he manfully refused the day nurse's assistance back to bed. The day nurse's uplifted brows betrayed her astonishment at the sudden turn for the better the young patient had taken. "I'm almost well," piped up Frank Wiley IV the moment the door closed behind the day nurse. "Tomorrow the doctor says I can sit out in the garden, in the sun. Couldn't I have Spot then?" "You just leave that to me," said Miss Beaver determinedly. "I may have much to say about your keeping Spot, Frank." In her heart she was in reality panic-stricken, for she knew that pretty Mrs. Wiley would indifferently laugh off the idea that ownership of a dog could mean returned health to her little son. Upon Frank Wiley III Miss Beaver felt no reliance could be placed. He was an uxorious weakling. Her unfounded hope rested on old Mr. Wiley alone. Old Mr. Wiley, whose firm mouth and implacable dark eyes made her feel that he and he alone held the key to the situation. That he had realized young Frank's need and had filled it, albeit in secret, gave her to believe that he would also furnish such good reason for yielding to young Frank's boyish yearning as would make Mrs. Frank retire in disorder from any contest of clashing wills. But when the old gentleman stepped into the room that night he did not carry the little dog under his arm. What he had was something bulkier. He stopped beside the basket which had been sent to Miss Beaver and which she had not yet opened. He leaned down and released the lid. A little fox terrier jumped out and stood, one small paw upheld, its head cocked to one side. Miss Beaver drew in a quick, gasping breath of admiring amazement at what she realized was the doctor's unusual prescription. If only old Mr. Wiley could stand by to uphold it, she felt that the boy could recover. She drew his attention with a gesture. "See how nicely our patient's coming along, Mr. Wiley," she whispered. "Oh, please won't you make them let him keep the little dog Paris sent him? You can, I know you can." Old Mr. Wiley leaned over the bed, apparently taking pleased note of the faint color on the boy's cheeks. He smiled with obvious satisfaction. He lifted his head, met Miss Beaver's pleading eyes, and nodded emphatically. Then he slackened his hold on whatever he had tucked under one arm and deposited it at the foot of the bed, meeting Miss Beaver's questioning eyes with a significant narrowing of his own. She looked at the thing, then up at him, puzzled. What he had brought in was one of those huge plush-covered atrocities with tall ivory letters on the front that proclaimed it to be a family album. She surmised that this must be the album which the doctor had said she should look over to note how closely the small boy in the bed resembled his ancestors. With a light gesture, old Mr. Wiley relegated the album to the background, his glance seeing the fox terrier that still hesitated in the middle of the room. Miss Beaver understood. She gently wakened the small patient, who sat up, rubbing sleepy eyes expectantly. The dog, sensing a playmate, bounded upon the bed and began lapping at Frank's eager fingers with small whimperings. "He loves me, don't you, Spot? Look, nurse, he has black spots over his eyes, bigger than I remember them. And he seems littler tonight, doesn't he? But he knows me. Gee, I wish I could keep him all the time." Old Mr. Wiley sat silently in a comfortable chair at the shadowy back of the room, as he had done on his previous visits, but his severe old features softened as he watched the happy child and the antics of the little dog. When at last Frank's eyes grew humid and heavy with sleep, and he began to slip down on his pillow, he clung to his canine playmate, refusing to relinquish the puppy which had cuddled cozily against him. Old Mr. Wiley's heavy brows lifted into a straight line over his high nose. A grimly ironical smile drew up the corners of his mouth. He made a gesture of resignation. His humorlessly twinkling eyes met the consternation in Miss Beaver's, but he appeared pleased and unmoved at the prospect of the dog's remaining with the boy. He rose from his comfortable chair, drew a deep breath, again touched the admonitory finger to his lips, and withdrew, still smiling. The door closed quietly behind his stately, blue-clad figure. Miss Beaver told herself agitatedly that he had no business to throw the onus of the whole situation onto her shoulders. But even while she resented this high-handed behavior, she was inwardly aware, with one of her strong intuitions, that old Mr. Wiley knew indubitably what he was about, and that the psychological moment he would justify her in permitting the dog to remain with young Frank. She was in no hurry the following morning to turn over her patient to the day nurse, and lingered on in the hope that Dr. Parris would appear early enough to get the dog away, as he had half hinted. That he would do his best to make the prescription stick she saw immediately after he took a single look at young Frank, who sat up nimbly, his color normal for the first time in weeks. The suppressed excitement in the atmosphere Dr. Parris could hardly be expected to understand until the boy drew back the covers to show the inquisitive black nose and beady eyes hidden beneath. "Gee, Dr. Parris, isn't he just the cutest dog you ever saw?" chuckled young Frank. "Oh, gosh, here she comes." The cover was whipped over the dog, whose whimpers subsided with uncommonly good sense. Perhaps young Mrs. Wiley might not have felt the puppy's presence, but Kiki's sharp nose was not so easily put upon. Kiki, with a shrill bark, scrambled from her arms and leapt upon the bed, where he began scratching furiously at the cover which Frank was holding desperately but vainly against this unexpected onslaught. "What on earth—" began his mother, her eyes going from Kiki to Miss Beaver's harried expression. "Oh, a nasty little dog right in Francis's bed. Francis, push it out. It's probably full of fleas. How did that nasty little mongrel get in here?" "This pup isn't a mongrel, Mrs. Wiley," snapped the doctor. "Anyone can see with half an eye it's a pedigreed animal." She disregarded him. "Frank, come here. Nurse, you should have known better than to allow that horrid little mutt—" Frank Wiley III almost ran into the room, obviously distressed over something quite different from his wife's troubles. "Somebody has meddled with one of our family portraits," he cried with obvious agitation. "It's been damaged." "Oh, "Bother the family portraits!" shrilled his wife, highly exasperated.